Great. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We're thrilled to be hosting this conversation with some really exciting guests today in our ongoing series about community planning. So we're joined today by local folks that went through the process of creating comprehensive planning in their community on the Bozeman Pass. And they are going to be able to share their stories of lessons learned for us. And I'm really looking forward to learning more about that process. So we'll have, as always, time for questions at the end. So feel free to put your questions in the chat as they arise during the conversation, and we'll have plenty of time for Q&A after the panel presents. I'm going to remind everybody to mute. Hearing a little bit of back, which I think may even be coming from the office. Guys. So as always, we're recording today's presentation. We'll share them on our website, and you can find this conversation and all of our past community conversations at pcecmt.org/community conversations. And before we get started, I'm going to do a quick introduction about PCEC and our work. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Michelle Ubaraga, and I have the pleasure of serving as the executive director for the Park County Environmental Council. We are your community conservation group. We work with people here in Park County to safeguard the land, water, wildlife, and people here in Yellowstone's Northern Gateway through grassroots organizing and advocacy. Park County is the traditional homeland of and current home to many Indigenous people across the region, and has a long tradition of human habitation of people who've loved, cherished, and stewarded this place. And we are committed to working together to honor that legacy and this place for future generations. We've been hosting these Zoom conversations about growth and planning for the past several years. We moved online with the pandemic, and our goal is to host conversations that help us all learn and gain a shared understanding about some of the most pressing conservation issues that we face as a community, so that we're more knowledgeable and prepared to advocate for this place. And our hope is that we create a community where we can discuss complex issues and have our questions get answered by one another and experts in our community. There's a lot happening around planning. We've been seeing more and more people retreating to gateway communities like ours to live near natural amenities, public lands, the Yellowstone River. And this trend's been happening for years, but with the pandemic, the increase in new residents in Southwest Montana is really quite remarkable. And so we're committed to working together and creating a vision for our community, what the community we want to become, rather than letting growth happen to us. So if you support this work and you like these community conversations, I do want to make sure and recommend that you consider making a donation or becoming a member to PCEC. Now is a really great time because of the countywide giving campaign hosted by the Community Foundation, Give a Hoot. Because of that, donations made during the month of July are partially matched, so every dollar goes farther. And we really love your help in reaching our goal of 100 new donations and $50,000. You can do that at giveahoot.com/PCEC. We'll also dump a link in the chat. The other thing that's really important to us is that when we show broad support for PCEC through Give a Hoot, I think it really gives us more clout in the community to say that people really do care about these issues. They care about safeguarding the land, water, and wildlife in our backyard, and that's why they support this work that we're doing. So every dollar matters, and we really appreciate your support. With that, I'm going to pass it over to our community planning expert, Jen Magic, to introduce our panel and kick us off today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Michelle. And thanks to all of you who were able to join us today. Today's conversation concerns a case study that's very familiar to me in my work in early days as a community planner. I worked for Gallatin County for a number of years. And this particular case study goes back 20 years. So back to some of my first days with Gallatin County. And I'm using it because despite some unique circumstances concerning the Bozeman Pass area, the planning process that we're going to go into here today follows a pattern that I have found to be very common. And that pattern concerns an unpleasant or incompatible use that threatens an area or neighborhood, so much so that neighbors, residents seek a planning-oriented remedy. So similar to the Bozeman Pass situation, the planning-oriented remedy doesn't happen overnight or through just one remedy. Typically, there are incremental steps taken to achieve the desired end. And that's the case here in the Bozeman Pass situation. Before we dive in, I just want to call your attention to the photo. This was taken earlier this week, and it's obviously an area that should be familiar to all of us. This is a pretty familiar human corridor to all of us, kind of the main drag between Livingston and Bozeman and beyond the Bozeman Pass area. But as you can see from the photo, it's an area that's very rural in nature, very low density residential, a lot of agriculture historically taking place and currently taking place in this area, and also a lot of wildlife. This is a human corridor, but it's also a wildlife corridor. We can see the Bridger Mountains in the background and kind of the strip of road there that's Jackson Creek. So the question a variety of people and decision makers have had to answer over the years is how to best protect this area. And that question came to a head at the start of the new millennium, when an out-of-state company, a company from New Jersey called the JM Huber Corporation, talked about extracting coalbed methane from approximately 18,000 acres along Bozeman Pass. So we've invited a couple of folks to join us today. Top of the list is Scott McMillian, which we all know today as the editor of the Montana Quarterly. He was formerly with the Bozeman Daily Chronicle. I got to know him back then as he covered this issue, and he covered it for a number of years. And the next slide is actually going to show a headline and opening paragraph to one of his stories back at 2001. And then we have two folks, Jennifer and Nona, who are and continue to be landowners in the area. They were part of an original citizen advisory committee that worked on some of the planning steps that ultimately led to this successful zoning district being created. And then lastly, we have Sean O'Callahan from the Gallatin County Planning Department. He's the planning director. He's not going to be able to join until 12:30. And Catherine Daly, also from the Gallatin County Planning Department. So here is one of Scott's earlier stories. This goes back to August 2001. I see Sean just about to join us, so welcome, Sean. But you can see this headline, Methane Company Meets Local Resistance. And then the opening line, Bozeman did not extend a warm welcome to the JM Huber Corporation, the company planning to drill for coalbed methane near Bozeman Pass during a packed public meeting Monday. And I attended that meeting 20 years ago. It was held at MSU and in one of the student union buildings, and it was indeed packed. And it had a considerable number of angry people. And Scott, if you want to unmute and maybe just spend a few minutes kind of talking about your experience covering this issue and some of the people that you ran into, including, you've got some of them on the line today, people you interviewed, including myself, Jennifer Reed. But if you just want to give a kind of a snapshot of how that process looked in your eyes as a reporter back then.
I think I'm unmuted now. The Huber people, I think they thought they were going to come in and bulldoze a trailer court. They just, not literally bulldoze it, but run over a bunch of rubes in the country. And they ran into the sophisticated, affluent, well-organized community who wasn't going to take it. They weren't going to take it lying down. And, they tried to come in and tell people that that area was already industrialized because there was a highway and a railroad. That got people excited. And this was also at the time when coalbed methane was making a terrible mess in eastern Wyoming and sending a lot of polluted water into the Tongue River in eastern Montana. There were all kinds of photos of coalbed methane fields with it seemed like they were paved with drilling rigs and roads and pump jacks. And it just wasn't anything that people wanted to see in that area. And the community made it very clear. They came in with the company came in with an amateurish slideshow trying to explain what methane was. I think everybody in there knows what methane is. And, I think it was a dicey prospect anyway. I remember talking to regulators and other industry people about, is there gas up there? That's a heavily fractured piece of geology. And most of the people I talked to outside of Huber believed that they wouldn't find much. And some regulators at the state level took the position of, well, let them drill their test rig and then go home when it comes up dry. But I think that's a risk the community wasn't willing to take. It was a very interesting thing for me to watch as a reporter. The community out-organized, out-thought, out-scrambled them. And the company thought they thought they had the world by the short and curlies, and they got a good lesson. They didn't. I'm not the one to talk about the zoning district that ensued. I'd let the other people talk about that, but it showed the power of a small group of organized locals. Jennifer Reed was a key leader at the time. I remember talking to her frequently, and it worked. They stopped them.
Yeah, so I appreciate that background, Scott, and it brings back memories, both good and bad. The bad was, seeing this company thinking it could just come in and do as it pleased. And speaking of Jennifer Reed and others, the residents who stood to be most impacted by this, of course, they wanted something done. And they came to the Gallatin County Planning Department asking for that, essentially asking for something to be done. Once again, looking for that planning remedy. And planning remedies, as we well know, take time. You cannot simply create zoning districts in a blink of the eye. We sometimes wish that, but they often take years. And thankfully, Montana's statute allows for a relatively quick solution and a quick way to create a zoning district when a governing body, when leadership believes an emergency exists, and it's called interim or emergency zoning. So the people in the Bozeman Pass area found out about emergency zoning and went to Gallatin County leadership and asked for it. And so it took actually like a year and a half, but ultimately the citizens got an interim zoning district in place for 2 years. And that interim district had two components to it. It regulated mineral development through a CUP process, but it also established a moratorium regulation that no mineral development would be allowed while this interim regulation was in place, giving people time to work on a permanent zoning district. So the next slide, I'm not going to let Scott get away with this because I still hold it against him, but I showed up on the front page of the paper, like larger than life. And it was like a day I wanted to spend in a closet. And Scott at the time was like, oh, it's not going to be a big deal. You know, we're just going to take your photo, but, you know, like big. So Scott, you still owe me for that.
All right, well, I'll buy you a beer, a cup of coffee, whatever. But even though I had nothing to do with the photo size or placement, that was somebody else.
That's what you said. Yeah. I'll take you up on the beer.
Okay.
So just to show this timeline, 1999, JM Huber comes in. They worked for a couple of years, buying up mineral leases, leasing mineral leases, buying up, leasing mineral rights on the 1,800 acres of Bozeman Pass. It wasn't until May of 2002 that Gallatin County Commissioners created the interim zoning district. Following that, a citizen advisory group starts working on permanent regulations. And we have Sean O'Callahan from the Gallatin County Planning Department that will help explain, you know, why it took 2 to 3 years to work on that regulation and get the permanent regulations in place. Because it wasn't until December 2005 that the zoning district, the boundaries were created, and then the zoning regulation created April 2006. So it took time, and it took time for a good reason, because between the interim zoning district and the permanent zoning district, a lot of changes were made. And the citizens between that time realized, hey, we don't want to just protect ourselves in this area from coalbed methane and mineral development. We want to look at the area comprehensively. And we want a zoning district that is going to, you know, cover it all as much as possible. So back in the early 2000s, this advisory committee was created, and we're really lucky today to have 2 members of that advisory committee. Jennifer Reed was co-chair and Nona Chambers, secretary. And I've asked them to join us today to kind of give their snapshot, their 5-minute summary on how this process worked from their perspective. And Nona and or Jennifer, I don't know who wants to go first, but speak up and feel free to jump in.
I'm happy to go first. Nona, do you have the time?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Jennifer Reed. I've lived in Gallatin County for over 30 years. Over 20 of those have been spent living in Jackson Creek, the Jackson Creek area of Bozeman Pass. My home is in a rural, quiet alpine valley, and I love it here. When an oil and gas company decided to apply for a permit to drill an exploratory coalbed methane well in 2001, we were shocked. We were appalled at what we learned. Neighbors got together and gathered information about coalbed methane, our quiet rural valleys could be transformed into an industrial zone. We organized and we met with the Gallatin County Planning Department. Jennifer Magic was the planner assigned to us. Thank you, Jen, for all of those years. Community education and outreach were first steps. We found tremendous support from our community. The site chosen for the first test well was actually in the Bridger Canyon zoning district. That district had been formed in 1972 as a citizen-initiated 101 zoning district. We realized that under state law, a citizen-initiated 101 district could regulate oil and gas development. It couldn't prohibit it, but it could regulate it. The only reason the permit could be denied was because the site was on already zoned land. We acted to propose the zoning district on land that was adjacent to the Bridger Canyon zoning district, but did not have the protection of being zoned. A new permit request was made on unzoned land. The Gallatin County Planning Department approved a moratorium and interim district to give us more time to form a zoning district. We worked closely with the Gallatin County Planning Department throughout the process of forming the district. Sonoran Institute helped guide us. We held community meetings to involve our neighbors in the process of deciding what landowners wanted their district to look like. We encouraged landowner involvement in a very inclusive process. We asked people what they wanted. We explained how zoning could help regulate oil and gas development. We talked about future growth in the area and how regulating density would help preserve wildlife populations and migration corridors. Many landowners agreed that they did not want industrial development and did not want to preserve wildlife. Many associated zoning with land use permits and being told what they could do with their private property. We compromised. Bozeman passed zoning regulation does not require land use permits for uses allowed by right. And that's why it took so long. There was a lot of controversy. There was a lot of submitting the regulation to the landowners of the district, because these 101 districts do require 60% of the landowners to sign on to the district. So first we tried to educate, then we opened it up, tried to get information from our neighbors. It was a very challenging process, and I think without Sonoran Institute, we wouldn't have had the tools to be able to get as many people involved as we did. And I think that I mean the compromise was really, that was a very important part of the process. It meant that we were learning how to work with our neighbors and how to make it work for everybody. So I think for 15 years, it's worked quite well. And in the last year, the Gallatin County Planning Department has come back to us and given us some great information and support on figuring out the new administrative regulation that will be an umbrella regulation on sort of on the top of all of the 101 zoning districts, so that there is a little bit more predictability. And with their tremendous workload, they can have that support tool in administrating all of these citizen created districts. And I think that it's time for Nona to go forward and contribute.
Thanks, Jennifer.
You're welcome.
Okay, was a great synopsis. Much for that. Don't add, add no,
Hey, Nona, I'm
yes.
sorry to interrupt. You're breaking up a little bit.
Oh,
And sometimes it could help to turn your video off while you're talking.
okay.
And you actually sounded really good right then. So,
Okay. Well,
ooh, still breaking
can
up.
you hear me now?
Perfect.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. So my thoughts are that, you know, being very naive as a citizen, but passionate about our home and where we live, I got involved in the advisory committee. I was very concerned about the coalbed methane drilling. I live right at Chestnut on the interstate there where Trail Creek hits the interstate. And we've been there for over 40 years. But I was also best friends with my neighbor who was in his 80s at the time that we created this zoning district. And he was born on our street and died on our street. And he had a tremendous wealth of value and history to add to the area that increased my passion for wanting to protect it. And for me, part of that was the wildlife corridor, especially. And I think there's been many articles written about the ability of citizens-initiated zoning districts to protect wildlife when other planning tools have not been quite as successful. And I think we have a very small window in Montana to protect the wildlife corridor, especially as we become inundated with development pressure. So for me, I'm grateful that we were able to go through this process. As Jennifer said, it very much was getting to know our neighbors, sitting down and having tea with them, talking with them about zoning, which that most of them had never really been familiar with or knew what the options were, and just sitting down over a cup of coffee to talk about what it was important to them and trying to compromise about things. You know, everyone feels very differently about many issues revolving around their home and their environment. And it became very clear that, you know, any document that we came up with was going to be a compromise. And I think part of what drives us forward, especially now, 15 years later, with proposed new changes, is that I think we feel a certain responsibility to honor what those citizens did when they created it and some of the compromises that were made, even though some of them are very difficult for some of us. So it was an amazing process, really. It did take a long time, lots of meetings. I think we are forever grateful for the county planning department for their assistance and help with that, as well as the GYC, the Yellowstone Coalition, and also the Sonoran Institute just really gave us incredible tools, as Jennifer said, to help us understand what our options were, what the process was, and really helped us meet our needs in terms of protecting what was important to us. That's all.
Thanks, Nona. That's great. Awesome background. And just real credit to the Citizen Advisory Committee and those who joined and added, who weren't necessarily on the committee, but helped with the process. Once again, you know, it's a multi-year process that can be both tedious and frustrating. Speaking of having to make compromises and work with people that you might not necessarily see eye to eye with. And Sean O'Callahan has a lot of experience in that world. He's my former colleague, and when I first started working on the Bozeman Pass issue, a couple of years into it, I passed it on to Sean. Maybe I had other stuff going on, but yeah, I think it needed a fresh set of eyes too. So it was great to pass it on to my colleague at that time. So I'm really pleased to have Sean here today. He is the Gallatin County Planning Director, a position that I held for a couple of years. And Sean, just if you could kind of touch upon, we started talking about how some of these zoning districts start. And very often, similar to the Bozeman Pass situation, they start with a use that people aren't really happy with. You know, the wedding facility comes into a neighborhood, a gravel pit, event center, or a coalbed methane field, or inappropriate subdivision. And they come to the planning department asking for help. And very often we say, you know, really the only thing that can help you is zoning. And so can you kind of talk about that pattern, and then also talk about how Gallatin County has managed that pattern and people's demands for zoning? I know you have numerous zoning districts now, many more than when I left a number of years ago, and you've had to manage that and administer all of that. So Sean, I'll turn it over to you here.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Jennifer. I'm Sean O'Callahan, and as Jennifer described, you know, the foundation and all the hard work was done on the Bozeman Pass zoning district. Thanks to everyone who was involved in that process. I came in at the very end of it and helped usher it through the adoption process. So as I said, I think 95% of the difficult work and difficult conversations had already taken place. But just to give everyone a little bit of background, Gallatin County currently has 22 zoning districts. That seems like a crazy number in my eyes. There's other counties in the state that have more though, so there's a sense of relief there. And there's two different processes in state law for counties in Montana to create zoning. There's what's called the citizen initiated process, which is sometimes referred to as the Part 1 zoning. And then there's the county initiated process, which is called Part 2 zoning. Right now, Gallatin, and for several years, Gallatin County has held steady. 15 Part 1 districts are citizen initiated, and 7 county zoning districts. Statute really does place an emphasis in terms of the proactive petition requirements. Citizens are required, I should say proponents of zoning districts are required to get signatures in support of zoning from 50% of property owners to do the citizen initiated zoning. There's not that strict citizen petition threshold for county initiated zoning, although here in Gallatin County, our commissioners really want to see a strong showing of citizen support at the front end of any county zoning process. So while according to law, there's not that citizen petition requirement, politically, there's something very similar here in Gallatin County. So in short, all of our zoning here in the county that we have has had to have a significant amount of public participation and public support on the front end before our commissioners will even consider creating zoning, whether that's a requirement of law or not. Our zoning districts kind of run the spectrum from, say, a zoning regulation that's really focused on agricultural preservation and open space preservation, like we have in the Spring Hill zoning district, kind of on the north part of our county and the west flank of the Bridgers, to facilitating development of a resort community like we have in Big Sky, to simply regulating signage that residents found obtrusive in the Gallatin Canyon. So the purposes and intent and background of our districts all sort of run the gamut. You know, at the root of each of them is some sort of community or neighborhood and their very specific concerns. I think it's human nature. Zoning can really be proactive or it can be reactive. We have very few examples of proactive zoning. Usually there's been some sort of catalyst, as Jennifer mentioned, whether it's proposed oil and gas development or a gravel pit or a subdivision that people didn't like, that has caused members of the public to get together and kind of go through this process of creating zoning. Emotions tend to run a little bit higher with reactive zoning efforts, which can complicate the process in some ways, but I think it's human nature to be reactive, and sometimes it's a good thing that there's a catalyst to bring people together and protect against future similar things happening and getting a zoning district on the books. I don't want to go into too much technical detail about the differences between the Part 1 and the Part 2 zoning. Just recognize that statute does provide some differences. And I would say the legislature just this past session has changed the requirements for both. And so it's something to be aware of. With the history of Bozeman Pass and the kind of timeline slide that Jennifer had up here first, with Bozeman Pass and many of our other districts, you know, a district boundary was established, and then, you know, sometime later a regulation was adopted. That's no longer an option. State law is now requiring that you have to have the district boundary and the regulations kind of at the same time. So there's always kind of the technical requirements to pay attention to, but the heart and soul of any grassroots zoning effort is that process of communicating with the people that live, you know, in a certain area, a proposed boundary, and having those difficult conversations and figuring out where there's common ground and moving forward and building trust. And I think Bozeman Pass is a great example of that. There really was, I think, a wide variety of public opinion, but they were unified in their concern about the coalbed methane development. And thankfully, largely as a result of everyone's efforts, there hasn't been any additional proposals for coalbed methane development in the area since the district was created. And so now we're undergoing the process as we're working on some other kind of administrative amendments, asking residents in the district, you know, how are the other provisions of the district working for you? Are there things we should consider updating or changing? Jennifer and Nona talked a little bit about land use permits. You know, that question's come up again. So zoning isn't meant to be forever, I guess, is kind of the thing I would part with. It's adopted, it's regulations that are kind of a snapshot in time. They need to be revisited periodically to make sure they're still relevant and workable as times change and community expectations change. So, but they can be a great tool for kind of protecting the characteristics of an area and dealing with some of the conflict that comes with land use change. So that's all I've got.
That's great. Thanks. It was an awesome summary. And I know you guys have your hands incredibly full trying to administer 22 zoning districts, not to mention all the places in between, which are, you know, can be a crapshoot. A lot of times people think that they can do anything in those unzoned areas, and that is not necessarily the correct assessment all the time. I put this map up of the Bozeman Pass zoning district that was, finally adopted in 2006, just to show and demonstrate kind of what we talked about at the beginning. This district started as an interim district that was focused only on regulating natural resource development, so mineral development in the area. And it morphed over time within those 6+ years. And if you look at the district now, both north and south of I-90, there are different colors of the map. And then if you look closely, there are different designations, are AR40 and AR80 and PL 640. And these are essentially density assignments. So that was kind of one message we wanted to get across today, that as Park County contemplates use regulation, similar to the Bozeman Pass situation, regulating solely uses within a particular area, to look at that density component too, is where you can start to mitigate impacts from the wide variety of other uses out there that could impact an area, whether it's traffic on neighboring roads, impacting wildlife in negative ways, impacting water quality, water quantity, whatever it happens to be. There's just a wide variety of impacts depending on the specific area. And as Sean alluded to, and I don't know if Sean and or Catherine want to chime in on this, zoning is really set up to be fluid over time. Not only are zoning districts set up to have variances, but they're also set up to have amendments and zone changes and potentially language changes to the actual regulation. So they're intended to both change with the times, but then also change with individual circumstances. So once you get on the ground, a variance could be justified, a change to the language or a zone change. So you kind of put a regulation in place kind of with your best intentions, but you certainly can't anticipate everything that's going to happen, including perhaps in the case of Bozeman Pass, some far-fetched mineral extraction procedure that isn't anticipated by the natural resource CEP section. So they're intended to change over time. And I don't know if our planners want to speak to that a little bit.
Catherine, do you want to take that? It's kind of a good segue into some of the items you were asked to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Jennifer is absolutely right. I think our goal with any regulation is that it's responsive to existing conditions. And those conditions can be, the topography, the existing built environment, and sort of the aspirations and goals of, the people inhabiting that area, not to mention climate. So there are all kinds of factors that, affect existing conditions. And those, of course, presumably through the process of, neighborhood planning or at a much higher level, something like a growth policy would be translated into values and goals, which then in turn would be refined into a zoning regulation. And the process, just because conditions are changing rather fluidly on the ground and in the environment, doesn't necessarily mean that the process for updating a regulation will be just as fluid and happen quite as easily. Sean touched on the importance of trust building in that process and the opening of lines of communication. I think something that I've really seen with folks in Bozeman Pass and heard from Jennifer and Nona is this sort of learning curve that folks go through, either when they are learning about planning and zoning for the first time, or if they're relearning it, you know, however many years after they were involved in an initial planning process. And that not only includes, you know, getting reacquainted or acquainted with the terminology, but it also involves sort of reevaluating where individually you stand in relation to sort of the values and goals that you either previously brought to the process or figuring out where you stand to them in general. So I think a big part of updating existing regulations is this sort of intensive evaluation of objective existing conditions as they might be perceived. Sometimes in collaborative processes, it's necessary for folks to do joint fact finding to even agree upon what the existing conditions are. That seems to be the case with the question around land use permits in Bozeman Pass, and please, Bozeman Pass folks, jump in if you want to add anything to this, but our current attempt or our current process for updating the Bozeman Pass regulations to incorporate these standard set of administrative regulations has brought forth a question for district community members about sort of what are the existing conditions in Bozeman Pass now, and do they now merit broader requirements for land use permits? And so something that you might see in this, you know, sort of initial phase where people are, again, learning the terminology, figuring out what conditions on the ground are, figuring out where they stand in relation to certain values and goals, is that you might have one objective and you might continue pursuing that one objective, and you might realize there are some other sort of thornier issues or other sort of companion issues and objectives that might need additional processes or additional time. So I think, like I was saying, the open lines of communication are very important. And as part of that, listening for certain topics, certain aspects of the process that might require a different approach or might require additional time. So that's my initial response to that prompt. Jennifer, is there anything you would like me to follow up on more, or I don't want to just keep?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much, Catherine. I think we would like to open it up to some questions. We have about 10 minutes left, so there may be questions of Catherine and Sean and or Jennifer and Nona. So Michelle, do you want to help with that?
Yeah, I don't see any questions in the chat yet. But I think if we wait for a moment here.
Or any points that have been raised that some of our speakers want to address?
You know, I mean, I have a question, and I feel like this has come up, but it's something we struggle with here in Park County, Jen, is the balancing the feeling of urgency with there's more and more growth happening and it feels very urgent to do something, with the need to go slow and intentional and bring the community along. And how do we carry both of those values together? And I would love to hear if anybody has insight that we could learn from on how, as a community, we can, you know, move, go slow to go fast, or address the urgent issues, but in a way that brings everyone along and is thoughtful and inclusive.
Hey, Sean, do you want to try that first, and then I can pick up?
I can also take that too.
I think that's a fantastic question, and there's no easy answer to it. It's I think we're just, for example, over on this side of the pass, we are starting the public hearing process with our county commission next week for the adoption of our growth policy. The last growth policy was actually adopted when Jennifer Magic was planning director over here in 2003. And on the front end of this effort, we did an awful lot of public outreach to identify, the things that people really cared about and the things that people were concerned about. And we structured the whole document around those themes. And so I think, my answer is, you kind of have to have a lot of patience and a lot of opportunity for dialogue and understanding core issues and core values of the community you're working with in order to, craft any planning solutions, whether that's a policy document like a growth policy that's not regulatory or a zoning regulation. What are the things that, people really care about in their community? What are the things that people are concerned about? And what level of tolerance do people have for different tools being applied? And so it takes, a lot of patience, a lot of communication, a lot of dialogue, and hopefully through that dialogue around shared values, there's trust being built and relationships being built that allow processes to be effective and successful.
That's great. Thanks, Sherry. Catherine, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So prior to joining Gallatin County, I worked in dispute resolution and consensus building around planning issues. And this is a key aspect of that type of work, and of course also of planning, because when folks get inspired by something, they want to move on the issue right away. Or when you see the kind of growth that's occurring in this region more broadly, you obviously want to act. And I think for when you're coming at it with a lens of consensus building, the aim of which is to create outcomes that are fair, stable, and wise, right? You want to bring as many people along in the process as possible. And, again, this theme of trust keeps coming up over and over again. And Sean mentioned it, and it is absolutely huge. And a big component of trust is listening to and hearing the folks who are concerned and folks who aren't concerned. And at least for me, that's always sort of the first stage in a process like this, is finding out how people are actually thinking about this issue and really listening to them and saying, at this stage, we really want to find out how folks are feeling. What is the existing condition related to the concern, related to the urgency? Because if you don't really understand what people's interests are at the outset, it's going to be very, very difficult to design a process that meets those interests later on, right? If you hear somebody say, I really don't want a stop sign at the corner of X Street and Y Street. I really, really, really don't want it. And you hear that and you don't take the time to ask them why, what are the underlying goals and priorities and needs that you're trying to meet with this. You might just go forth and say, I'm going to design a process to prevent a stop sign. Whereas perhaps their goal there is, they're really sensitive to noise and they don't want people's engines turning on and off, or, perhaps they have a flower bed and the exhaust from the bus is gonna, somehow harm it, or, some other reason, right? And so that initial phase of listening not only helps you design a process that matches the needs and priorities of the community, it also helps people feel heard, right? And when people feel heard, they are it sort of brings the temperature of a conversation down, and B, it opens up the conversation where folks are able to listen to each other better, right? So a big part of sort of going slow to go fast is making sure that you're setting up any process for success. And like I said, that has implications for process design. So, you know, what are you focusing on? And also for how people communicate with each other in the process. Moreover, an initial phase related to this kind of listening and talking can have really far-reaching impacts when it comes to trust building, right? And if the goal of your process includes building consensus around how to address a difficult challenge, then trust is going to be, you know, critical to that process. Last but not least, one more, you know, important aspect of going slow to go fast is that it helps bring decision makers along, right? So if you have a small group of people who are pushing stridently for a particular outcome, and they are pushing fast and they are not bringing others along in the process, it's very possible that when the proposal gets in front of a decision maker or somebody with some other kind of authority to determine, you know, the outcome, they might say no, right? That's another key consideration anytime you're designing a public process is, you know, you need to make sure that you have buy-in, not only from the people who are most passionate about it, but also from the decision makers, you know, who have the power to decide the outcome. So those are some initial thoughts about going slow to go fast.
Great, thank you. I love that. Go slow to go fast. I think an important thing to add there too is, and it wasn't explicitly stated, but it's should be obvious that, I mean, it's quite possible to get it wrong, you know, to get the components of your planning wrong, to have a mismatch between the regulation, what you're proposing, and the landscape. So to get it right often requires everything that Sean and Catherine just talked about, you know, looking at your facts, doing on the ground research, getting buy-in, building trust, not only buy-in from the public and residents, but your decision makers, and making sure staff is brought along too, and staff has a good understanding, and that you have the capacity on the staff end to both administer and enforce what you're going to propose. Otherwise, you're going to put up a regulation with no enforcement that could sink. So any other questions as we head into the last couple of minutes here?
Jen, I just want to thank Catherine for bringing up stop signs as an example, because I think, and that has come up in city topics where, you know, lots of people, we share values that we want safety for our children. So do we need more stop signs or fewer? Like, do stop signs increase safety or decrease safety? And that I just had some really interesting conversations with folks about that. And really what it's about is just getting to our core values there and then deciding whether more stop signs would lead to more safety or not. And Bozeman and Livingston both have all these unchecked stop signs. So I appreciate that you brought that up as an example, and perhaps stop signs could be a whole future community conversation. So with that, yeah, Jen, I think I didn't see any other questions in the chat. I have to say I'm so grateful for the expertise here today and that you all gave your time and showed up to share with our community. Thank you so much for being here. And Jen, I don't know if you want to share about our next community conversation. Is that, oh, there we go. I'll pass it over to you and we'll be able to wrap up right at 1. Does that sound good?
Yeah, sounds great. So also thanks to Scott, Jennifer, Nona, Sean, and Catherine for joining us today. So our next conversation, we keep trying to hit now the first Wednesday of the month, noon to 1. We're going to talk about neighborhood plans. It's yet another tool in the community planning toolbox. And Gardner happens to be working on a neighborhood plan right now. It's kind of a tried and true tool that we really would like to help explain more about. So thanks to everyone for your time today. Enjoy kind of the beautiful day, and hopefully we get some rain this afternoon, please. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.